Thank you very much. It's a huge honor to be here. There's a lot of people in this room I admire a great deal. I also want to thank the translators. They're excellent and working very hard. In 1924, I'm going to get going. I'm going to read quickly, so apologies to the aforementioned translators. In 1924, Le Corbusier conjured a 3,000-year-old Babylonian queen as he confessed that the most utopian feature of his vision for modern cities was, in fact, deeply ancient. The gardens of Semiramis have come to us, he wrote. They are useful and they are beautiful, unquote. The architect promised that hanging gardens would recover all of the natural ground lost by building in his cities, exchanging oppressive urban density for a pastoral bliss mechanized by cars and airplanes. He constructed 2 prototype roof gardens at Stuttgart's Waisenhofsiedlung exhibition, where he also first presented his 5 points for architecture. These included the replacement of pitched roofs with flat terraces, which would, quote, become the favorite part of the house, unquote, for future families, and keep the avant-garde promise of light and air for all. The pathway to utopia would thus leap from the walls of ancient Babylon and skip across Stuttgart before converging with the sylvan horizon of the radiant city. This elevated garden pathway had, however, been traveled before, and in fact quite recently. Le Corbusier might have summoned the Babylonian queen playfully, but as the everyday citizens of Stuttgart began referring to the Waisenhofsiedlung as the Araberdorf, or Arab village, they sardonically underlined the obvious debt that it owed to traditional architectures of the Near East. Roof gardens were not new, and indeed they were presently enjoying a great international flowering, now mostly forgotten, that was frequently called upon to improve the lives of the very same city dwellers and workers who the avant-garde promised to serve. The architectural compositions of these high gardens were varied, but classical architects consistently worked to grace their buildings with roof gardens in coherent, unified ways, forging a wonderful but understudied type of both classical and modern space. As one of the lost wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon had long haunted modern imaginations. In the Renaissance, efforts to reconstruct ancient roof gardens with drawings and revive them with buildings attended the wider rebirth of classical architecture. The humanist Pope Pius II hired Bernardo Rossellino to build a roof garden over the stables at his palace in Pienza as early as 1459. Filarete's circa 1464 treatise on architecture included a palace bristling with trees and statuary. Interestingly, he described these elevated green spaces as modern in the sense that they were, quote, built in a new manner, high and all on columns, unquote, and he wrapped them with a simple railing that struck a light contrast with the sturdy colonnades below. Indeed, the railing posts do not even align with the facade's trabeated grid, and some are perched on the extreme edges of cornices, removing them from the structural language of loads and lifting. Filarete was already contending with the problem that many modern classicists would have to tackle: how to incorporate garden perimeters into a facade so that they appear orderly and harmonious, but still light and airy. Pergolas, in particular, would prove useful, serving as a veritable roof garden order. Le Corbusier would later declare that the revolution of reinforced concrete would transform rooftops from a no-man's land haunted by cats, remember that language, haunted by cats, into platforms for human happiness. Already, in 1782, however, the Parisian Jean d'Etienne had developed a waterproof cement and used it to crown his townhouse on the outskirts of Paris with a roof garden. Architect Jacques-Guillaume Legrand assisted him in the design of a space ringed by trellises and punctuated with a pavilion that, together with foliage and freestanding spiral columns, announced the miraculous garden to passers-by below. D'Etienne concluded his pamphlet with the statement, quote, this custom of the ancients, revived in our time, would undoubtedly honor this century, when virtue sits on the throne, seeking truth, protecting the arts, and allowing genius free power to astonish the universe, unquote. His garden was lost after the French Revolution, and immediate attempts to replicate his success with such a large space were usually disappointing. Smaller roof gardens, however, began to grow. In the mid-19th century, gave rise to a transatlantic roof garden movement that achieved a critical mass of success by the dawn of the 1900s. Their hopes were similar to those later cited by the avant-garde. Elevated green spaces might redeem industrial urban life, improving homes for the middle and working class families whose domestic space was squeezed by economic pressures. In 1859, W. Bridges Adams, an English writer, anticipated the logic of Le Corbusier by half a century when he insisted, quote, "The space for gardens in London is equal to that of the whole of the city. So then, are the buildings to be cleared away? Not so, only the roofs of the buildings," unquote. English writer Charles Reade repeated the call, presaging Le Corbusier with a humorous attack on the so-called blunders of Victorian architecture. Quote, "The conical roof robs the family of a whole floor and gives it to cats. A poor fellow who works all day in a hole might smoke his evening pipe and see a wide tract of verdure, but the builders build the roof for cats," unquote. Meanwhile, in 1872, New Yorkers envisioned a, quote, "city of the future," unquote, consisting of apartment towers with tall roof gardens. The healthfulness and beauty of such green spaces would bless every family, they said, and slow the exodus of the prosperous to the suburbs, then already underway. They predicted pergolas sheltering these sun-drenched spaces. Both Americans and British also imagined roof gardens encased in boxy mansard glass houses. William Henry Lascelles erected a wooden and glass conservatory atop the iron-reinforced concrete slab roof of his London townhouse in 1874. A few years later, public roof gardens began sprouting atop New York theaters. These vied to outdo each other until 1892, when a clear champion emerged atop Madison Square Garden. There, guests reveled in a space wrapped by colonnades and belvederes that beckoned to pedestrians below like the elevated courtyard of an Andalusian mosque. Who was the first man to introduce the roof garden to this city, a critic asked in 1906. Was it not some descendant of those Babylonians who enjoy the pleasures of the hanging gardens, unquote? The original reforming goal of roof gardens was not, however, forgotten, as another writer asserted in 1891, "On the housetops, far above the city smells, the dust and the oppressive heat, there is health-giving oxygen for weary workers. A flat roof, unused, is neglected, wasteful opportunity. In a thickly settled city, that neglect is criminal." Hotels became extremely common sites for roof gardens in these years. Some pergolas, such as the first decade of the 1900s set the tone for modern classical roof garden design. A Chicago commentator noted how most elevated green spaces failed to measure up to the traditional concept of a garden, which, quote, "involves shade from trees and turf to walk upon. But a very good substitute for trees on the roof garden is a trellised pergola. This is easily made with creepers and with plants below makes a beautiful roof promenade. There is a future for the hanging gardens," unquote. The bristling pergola of the 1901 New York Yacht Club established its terrace as a floor stacked upon floors and promised the breezy afternoon of a summer at sea. The 1905 home of the Elks Club in Sacramento lifted its roof garden pergola with twinned piers and capped them with a stripped entablature and protruding rafter pairs. Belvedere balconies served as bookends, striking a balance between delicate lightness and rigorous structure. Charitable associations boasted roof gardens, too. Rochester's 1912 Young Women's Christian Association sported a deep roof garden pergola lifted with columns featuring Spanish bracket capitals. On the other extreme, the double colonnette pergola ringing the roof garden of the 1908 YMCA in Grand Junction, Colorado, was so lean as to become essentially symbolic. In 1913, a storm blew through this town, hurled portions of the thin roof garden pergola into the street, and killed a child. As roof gardens became more popular, municipal governments drafted codes to mitigate their increased risks of storm damage, fire, and falls. The building industry rose to the occasion. Established in 1906, the Union Metal Company had built a reputation for the mass production of durable, affordable, and academically correct metal columns and other classical elements. They issued catalogs featuring a special line of products aimed at roof gardens, explaining that the, quote, "ordinances of most cities prohibit any wood whatsoever in a roof garden. The Union Metal pergola is in such cases the only one that can be used and can be furnished with special steel beams and rafters to comply with regulations," unquote. A modern need was answered as classicism evolved. Hotels became extremely common sites for rooftop gardens in these years. Some pergolas, such as the one that crowned Louisville's 1905 Seelbach Hotel, seemed designed to court the eyes of people below, at least as much as they were built to shelter the bodies of guests. Others, like the long pergolas that crowned the recently expanded Manhattan Mass of Clinton and Russell's Hotel Astor in 1910, were nearly invisible from the street, but offered an immersive sanctuary with stunning views of the surrounding city. Elevated gardens were of special value when they provided safe spaces for socializing on hotels and apartment buildings geared towards single working people. At the 1905 Bachelor Apartment House in Washington, D.C., for example, the Tudor Revival facade's geometries of stone and brick were reiterated in the pergola's stone piers and moldings, brick recesses, and lacy lattices. Such residences were not charitable institutions, even though they were geared towards the softening of urban life for students and workers new to the city. Roof gardens became havens of radical potential, however, whenever they blossomed atop public libraries and model tenements, where reformers worked to equip the poor, especially recent immigrants, to survive. For decades, children of New York's Lower East Side were taught to read on top of the 1909 Seward Park Library roof garden, where architects Babb, Cook, and Welch wrapped the space with a balustrade and capped it with an open frame to support shade-giving awnings. Perhaps some of these youth went home to another roof garden if they were among the fortunate inhabitants of the Phipps houses, model tenements designed by Grosvenor Atterbury. Henry Phipps, the philanthropist behind them, echoed previous reformers and anticipated Le Corbusier when he explained the goal of his venture, quote, all the light and air possible, and spaces around them in which the children could play. Unquote. Every inch of Manhattan real estate was precious, so for play space, his architect crowned, and in the process unified, this brick fortress of philanthropy with a roof garden, capped by pergolas and framed by belvederes. Such spaces made a visible promise to the city below. In this building, your children will be lifted above the filth and danger of the streets to know roses and sunflowers. Hanging gardens were planted here not for an ancient queen, but for working mothers in the modern metropolis. New York was the epicenter of classical roof gardens in the early 20th century, but they also rose in other global metropolises such as Tokyo, Mexico City, and Cairo, where the aptly named Semiramis Hotel offered horizon-spanning vistas of antiquity itself. In Paris, as the 20th century loomed, speculation about the changes that modern technology would bring to city life had many eyes looking skyward. Books such as Albert Robida's The Electric Life offered visions of the future that were simultaneously beautiful, hilarious, and terrifying. With the coming of personal urban aircraft, Robida foretold, a most significant change would take place in building design. In the old days, one used to enter a building at street level. Now one enters a building through the top, and tenants enjoy their own private belvedere, unquote. Ubiquitous flight would result in ubiquitous roof gardens. Life imitated art in 1908 when architect M.F. Morin designed the mansard crown of a new apartment building in Paris to serve in the present as a high garden and in the future as a roof station for aeroplanes in the very center of the city, unquote. The roof terrace remains to this day, although the aircraft have been somewhat delayed, perhaps they are getting closer. Across the English Channel at precisely the same time, London was watching new hanging gardens rise on Oxford Street. Daniel Burnham, the American classicist made famous by his leadership of Chicago's 1893 Columbian Exposition, which we've heard about today, designed the vast Selfridges department store and capped it with a tremendous roof garden wrapped with beautiful pergolas. Citizens, quote, flocked to it in thousands to take in the air and see the view, unquote. The company compared their modern hanging gardens of London to the wonder of ancient Babylon in promotional materials. More roof gardens proliferated in the British capital, but none would compare to the stunning elevated green space that crowned Bernard George's 1930 stripped classical dairy and Tom's department store. There, in 1938, on a vaulted masonry roof built as if it was covering a subway station, landscape architect Ralph Hancock merged Tudor England and Mudéjar Spain in a series of spaces large enough to consume an entire afternoon. An Art Moderne tea pavilion acted as a foil for the classical gardens and was in turn bestowed with its own roof garden. Countless other European examples of modern classical roof gardens rose in the years before, during, and after Le Corbusier's efforts to draft them into the modern movement. Some of them had much heavier political commitments than gardens on top of department stores. In the same year that Jose Plesnik attempted to work the utopian dream of a garden city of sunshine and greenery for 40,000 people into a neglected portion of Ljubljana, he also lifted a conservatory garden to the top of an innovative apartment building. As historian Peter Trecic explained, the crystal corner of the 1934 Flatiron Building was a near-perfect replica of the architect's own suburban glass-enclosed winter garden. But here it was elevated into an urban highlight that graced the dense city streets as a public delight. Another striking middle-class apartment building had recently risen nearby in Milan. Giovanni Muzio's large dual-building Ca' Brutta block wielded traditional design elements with total freedom. Palladian forms allowed the building to speak in the clear terms of Italian tradition, but the motifs are varied as each individual flat asserts its own unique presence in the street and overall hierarchy dissolves, achieving what Francesca Biliani and others have described as a shift from the house of the individual to the collective, a fragmentary order that sits squarely between tradition and modernity, unquote. What has not received sufficient attention are the roof gardens that Muzio used to enhance the unity of the structure and refer to Italian gardens as well as villas, and which even crown the arch that links the two buildings of the Ca' Brutta. Filarete would have recognized this as a feature of a modern palace, even if Muzio did not design it for traditional royalty. Still more utopian, and my final example, was the public housing complex designed in Rome a few years later by Innocenzo Sabatini, one of his many. Insisting that he would never abandon the classical, the architect's commitment to providing light and air to the poor generated innovative new iterations of Roman traditions, from the ancient to the Baroque, culminating in the reinforced concrete Casa del Sole of 1930. Stepping up from the street in a series of terraces, like modern visions of Babylon, the roof gardens of his masterpiece were a gift that Sabatini gave to the whole city. Queen Semiramis would have probably been delighted to see her legendary achievement still bearing new fruit, even if his pathological hatred of urban density blinded him to the beauty of the streets of Paris. Le Corbusier was correct to repeat and reinforce the long-standing belief in the wonderful potential of roof gardens to augment the light and air of urban conditions, recover natural ground lost to building, and provide extra living space to working families, whatever becomes of the poor cats or lingering dreams of urban aircraft. Roof gardens and their proud pergolas, note the pergolas, are among the greatest, if also some of the most neglected gifts of the classical tradition. They are also, of course, modern, and indeed they are among the most modern of spaces, in part because they have been modern for such a long time. Thank you.